What are the best men at arms? Like, actually the best. I thought I knew. Like many people, I saw the Varangian veterans and thought, wow, these guys are going to dominate. Only to discover that they perform well in terrain that I don't have, and is nowhere near me, that they counter a unit that doesn't yet exist, that they're constantly outnumbered, and once you go to feudal, you go bankrupt. Never mind, become Christian, join the Crusade. Perhaps in the Holy Land, their prowess will be shown. Well, too bad, because the Middle East has the mighty Mabarism. And if you plan on staying here, you better hybridize, because the only true counter to the Mabarism is more Mabarism. But does that make them the best? Maybe. If you look at Reddit, you believe that they're all overpowered. But everything's overpowered if you stack enough buffs on it. In this video, we're going to look at every man-at-arms and how they all compare, focusing mainly on battle, a little on war, early game, late game, no buffs, all the buffs, counters and terrain, generic and culture specific, including everything in the new Persia DLC, a true deep dive. So when it comes to picking men-at-arms, you'll only choose the best. For this, I have written a Python script that can recreate any battle we want, minus the random elements. So that's everything excluding commander roles and night events, and surprise reinforcements. And to look at performance, we're going to break this video down into multiple parts. Firstly, how their stats compare for each stack. Secondly, how their stats compare considering cost effectiveness, so how much bang for buck. Then we'll look at the script to recreate scenarios at different stages of the game. Early game or survival, when a single battle dictates the outcome of a war. Middle game, when war consists of multiple battles and strategy becomes important, as does preserving your troops. And late game, when you just want to wipe out stacks of your enemy troops as quickly as possible. Then we'll summarise the good, the bad, my favourites, and how strategy or the war outside battles can impact the effectiveness of your men-at-arms. And I hope you like graphics because there are plenty of them. Obviously, some troops like Cav are going to struggle if we look purely at battles, but I hope we can take that into account. Mixed compositions, building attributes and siege will not be in scope as they add another layer of complexity that deserve their own video. Finally, we will not be considering accolades men-at-arms or any order men-at-arms like pirates and order knights, nor the house guard. They're either unobtainable to the player or limited to a regiment of one. Every regiment is made up of stacks, and bar some cultural traits and bespoke units, each regiment has the same number of stacks they can squeeze in, and ideally you want as much damage as possible. Even with buffs, that still means you want a high base damage. Because high damage doesn't just mean winning, it means winning quicker, and winning quicker means less troops dying, less negative night events, more likely to stack wipe, and enemy reinforcements are less effective or don't make it in time. And if you look at the top performers, they are heavy cav and heavy infantry, no surprises here. But more often than not, you won't have the purse to fill your army with gendarmes, you'll need to count your pennies. So let's do the same, but this time how much damage can you get for 1 gold of monthly raised upkeep? And when we do that, we see the top 10 are entirely bowmen. Well, except for this cheeky Pacheri creeping in. And right there we have it. Heavy cav and infantry when money isn't a problem, and bowmen when it is, right? Well, maybe, but we haven't considered toughness and number of troops. If you had an infinite amount of levies to soak up the enemy's attack, then damage would be the only metric that matters. That said, if you had an infinite number of levies, you wouldn't be bothering with men-at-arms, or even this video. So let's run a script and look at the first of the scenarios. For this, we're looking at winning a single battle, and in this case, a single battle determining the outcome of the war. We've all been there, in Ireland, Noobland, when you wail on your neighbour, and once the first battle is done, it's all over for them. Or when you surprisingly lose, there isn't much you can respond with. And whoever won the first battle is unlikely to lose the next one, unless you roll terribly. In this situation, there is limited strategy, and concepts like winning quickly or winning with little losses aren't as important as just straight up winning. So, now toughness and numbers, as well as damage, matter. We just need a fair test. And for that we're going to look at cost effectiveness of any men at arms against 1000 levies. Essentially, how much money do you need to win the battle? I'm focusing on cost because most of the time your finances are going to be limited, not the number of regiments, especially at this stage in the game. And I chose levies because, well, they are constant. They are everywhere. Everyone has them, the AI always uses them, they never change. You cannot buff levies, they only ever increase in number. So any men at arms that can dispatch levies is always going to be useful. And just a reminder, this is without advantage and no commander rolls. So let's run the script and remember to pause if you want to have a good look to see where your favourite man at arms scores. And with that we can see the heavy units have dropped to the bottom, with the beloved elephants now worst. And on top, well, it's entirely bowmen, the top being the late medieval version of the longbow. There's also light footmen too. I must confess, I didn't know what a Shoma was starting this video. It's a unit limited to Israeli cultures, so perhaps not often seen, but it's level with longbowmen. And then you have the Geodendag, the Dutch late medieval light footman. Now, what is notable about these top 10, despite a lot of them being obtained quite late in the tech tree, is that they're all cheap. Really cheap. In fact, Shoma costs the same as generic light footmen, but have 50% more toughness for not a penny more. And because they are cheap, they are numerous, and that is key. A quick bit of maths. For a simple one-on-one regiment battle, let's say 1000 levies versus 1000 levies, the amount of damage is 0.03 times the damage times the number of troops. And for this case, for both armies, it would be 300 damage each. Now, calculate their losses, it would be the damage done to the opposing army minus their toughness, meaning that both armies would lose 30 troops on that turn. Divide that number by the total number of troops they started with, and you have the percentage losses, which is 3% on either side. This gives us a nice simple equation, easy peasy. But to ensure you don't lose a battle, your percentage losses must be level pegging with your enemy at a minimum. Because without reinforcements or a good roll, typically once you start losing, it just gets worse. So we can write the equation as the following. And simplifying this equation, we get the following. Note that the strength is squared. This means if the enemy doubled their numbers, I would need to quadruple my damage or toughness to match my losses. With how the cost is spread amongst your men at arms, the cheapest way to buff your side of this equation is strength. Now, one thing you might be thinking, I haven't mentioned combat width yet. And that's fair. The equation above omits this, so let's run the actual battle script for the first time, and see what the minimum amount of money needed to defeat 1000 levies with combat width incorporated is. And well, what we see was a surprise to me, and I'm sure you. Nothing much has changed at all. In fact, the top 10 are the same, but now with Shoma on top. I repeat, a light footman is number 1. What's happened here is that even though the Shoma is one of the cheapest and therefore most numerous, it still benefited from the combat width. It was enough to push it to the top, which seems counterintuitive, but fundamentally this is something all men at arms are taking advantage of in this test. So that's it, the Shoma. The greatest men at arms? Maybe, but we have some more scenarios to test. Another thing some of you will be correctly thinking is, if this is survival, surely I'm bringing everything I have, including my levies. And this is true. Perhaps now our heavy cav can use peasants as fodder while they deal damage. So, what we're going to do now is run the same script but include another axis, a second dimension if you will, with minimum goal to win on the y-axis and supporting levies on the x-axis. To keep it simple, I have included only generic men-at-arms as I'll quickly run out of colours, 0 levies on the left as in the previous chart, and 1000 levies obviously everyone can win with the smallest investment. We can see that the results are basically the same. Crossbowmen are most cost effective, albeit unlocked in high medieval, with bowmen and light footmen next and almost level pegging. It appears that the bowmen become more cost efficient around the 600 levies mark, and all the others are left trailing behind, so even with support your heavy cav isn't doing any better. Now, I cannot say there isn't an effect. There are interceptions like bowmen and light footmen mentioned earlier, and heavy cav and light cav. That heavy cav curve shows us that high damage and low toughness units do better the more supported they are. However, this isn't enough, not nearly enough to match, say, crossbowmen. If we take the top 5 performers with any number of levies, we can see the same characters from the previous top 10, but late game non-bowmen really stand out. And just quickly, here are some fan favourites and how they perform against light footmen and crossbowmen. Note Palatini and Nalcor Praetorians in the files, and Connie are Hussars for some reason, I have no idea why. But I am sorry if I've lowered your opinion of your favourites, but they're very expensive, except on bowmen, they're great. Now, again, we could argue that this isn't a fair representation of a normal battle. Where are the knights? Well, if we give both armies, say, 5 knights of similar abilities, the results look pretty much the same. What if we replace 500 of the enemy levies with bowmen to simulate a high damage army? Still the same pattern. Well, maybe the issue is we're not buffing the troops enough. If you're a power user of men-at-arms, you'll be building the buildings that boost them. Well, if we go back to fighting just 1000 levies, and we give every men-at-arms a 100% buff to their toughness and damage, we still see the same patterns, even with plus 200% the same again. There are some small changes between bowmen and light footmen, but do heavy cav and infantry close the gap? No. So far, archers and light infantry are in the lead. Before we move to the next test, I wanted to discuss terrain, as it seems appropriate to introduce it now, as well, terrain is really important. In fact, a lot of the time, where you fight has a greater impact than the quality of troops you're bringing. So, for example, let's take the incredible crossbowmen, and let them fight in hills against 1000 levies, and compare them to, say, camel riders, also in hills. Obviously, crossbowman wins. But switch from hills to desert, and suddenly Dromandaries have the upper hand, dominate in fact, and that difference can be just a single barony away. How about we look at a mountain? They serve as one of the many choke points on the map, and their combat width penalty of 50% can help when outnumbered. Firstly, looking at generic men-at-arms, pikemen are now level pegging with crossbowmen because of that sweet terrain bonus, as well as armoured footmen closing the gap on bowmen because they're exploiting the reduced combat width just like pikemen. Changing to the top 5 men-at-arms at any point, the list is completely different from what we had in the generic group. The Horn Warriors now on top, whatever that is, and the new Super Zupins are making an appearance. Note that even with the combat width now tiny, the Manaspa, a heavy cav with an advantage in the mountains, is still not making an appearance into the top men-at-arms. Some other examples include the Drylands, where a new mix of men-at-arms shine, the hills, where having a bow is a boon, the forest, where the Metatja are wood elves, and the steppe, where you really cannot beat the horse archers. I hope this demonstrates how important where you pick your battles is, and to a lesser extent where your domain is. As you deal with invaders and revolts, having troops that excel in defending your crown lands could be crucial. Something a certain men-at-arms excels at. Another thing we need to cover is countering, because alongside where you fight, who you fight is also key. Thinking about your men-at-arms may be marginal compared to how much you can impair theirs. For example, I am here, where the popular Ayar is used, and I could use those troops myself, or better yet, I could just counter them, in this case making loads of light footmen. Fortunately, because everyone's the same culture pretty much everywhere I want to expand, I will have the edge, but that isn't the case for everyone. Same with playing the ever-loved Matilda. All of my neighbours have pikes, so heavy infantry it is. Also, another point to consider is not all counters are equal. Countering only reduces the damage of troops, not its toughness. So for some troops like heavy cavalry, heavy infantry and bowmen, this is bad as their value comes from dealing damage, less so for pikes and light footmen. For example, let's say we're facing an enemy with a composition of 500 levies, 200 heavy infantry and 200 pikes. That means their total damage is 15,800. If I fully counter the heavy infantry with 400 light footmen, it's now 10,040. If I fully counter the pikes with 400 heavy infantry instead, it's now 11,840. So by countering the heavy infantry, I shave an extra 1,800 damage off. That's more than 10%. Also, some counters are far more expensive than others. Light footmen is a very cheap counter to heavy infantry, however, armoured footmen are a very expensive counter to pikemen. So my 400 light footmen only cost 1.5 in raised upkeep compared to a 4.8 for the heavy infantry. So with my light footmen, I am paying less than half to get way more damage reduction. Another result in favour of light footmen it seems, but every situation is unique. For some units like light horsemen, a big chunk of their value is in pursuit and screen, which cannot be countered, so it needs to be considered whether it's worth countering those units at all. Camel riders would be a good example of where it would be useful. As it stands, I would put the best counters as heavy cav, heavy infantry and bowmen, with the counters of light cav, pikemen and light footmen being less effective. Right, perhaps we should move on to the mid-game. Moving on from who can best handle 1000 levies in a mixture of scenarios, we now reach the point where we need to consider how our troops fare in a repeated succession of battles. What some might call a war, a proper war at least. Divide and conquer, breaking your enemies into bite-sized chunks. So now we're talking about stamina, longevity. And one way we could do this is see how many of our troops we have remaining at the end of a battle. But with the levies mixed in, we can see some troops, heavy cav and heavy infantry, are only doing well because all of your farmers are getting killed instead. Incidentally, bowmen suffer the same losses because they share the same toughness as levies. We could test it without peasants, but if your back's against the wall, you're going to bring everything you have, so this test is of limited use. To include levies and see how our army performs as a whole, our test will be how many battles we can win in a row before losing. A rough simulation of one of those whack-a-mole revolts you get. So let's give us an army of 1000 levies and add a certain amount of gold's worth of men-at-arms. Then let's pitch our army against waves of 1000 levies. So they'll definitely win the first few battles, but how many before they give out? So we have money spent on upkeep on the x-axis and number of wins on the y-axis. Starting with generic men-at-arms, it looks like all the troops that did well last time are performing well again. Crossbowmen are on top, followed by bows and light footmen. Note the higher up the men-at-arms is in this graph, the better it is doing. And if we switch to the top overall, it's bowmen, all types of bowmen. Again, bowmen are doing really well. And let me tell you, I buffed the troops 100% again, 200% again. I added knights on both sides, it changes nothing. The pattern you see here is pretty much what you get. Same with terrain. If it was important to start with, it's still important now. In the mountains, for example, mountaineers in Bacheri are doing well as they did earlier. Okay, so in repeated battles things are the same. But what about how quick the battles are? Often it's key to defeat your enemies before help can arrive. More time to clean up in the pursuit phase too. So, here is another chart, with the same army composition as before, 1000 levies plus men-at-arms versus 1000 levies, but this time with days spent fighting on the y-axis instead. Now things start to change. We see pikes and light footmen struggling to finish the battle in good time with funds increasing, but heavy cav and infantry getting far better. Crossbowmen still doing brilliantly, by the way. The latter three are doing so well because of the high damage. So if you want to win quickly, you want damage. If you want to buy time for, say, help to arrive, you want toughness. Both have valid use cases, but more often than not I find myself going for the former. This would explain why archers are doing so well when we look at the top performers. But to get some scope of how performance has changed, here are the top 20 with little funding against the top 20 with loads of funding. We start to see heavy cav creeped into the top. As for considering terrain, each terrain impacts men-at-arms differently. So for example, pikes only gain toughness in the mountains, so they will perform better but have little impact on the time. Horse archers get an insane damage buff on the steppe, allowing them to swallow whole armies before help can arrive. To show these, here are some of the biggest boosted damages from men-at-arms in given terrains. Along with horse archers, camels and horn warriors get insane buffs in their preferred terrain. Also, it helps catching the enemy in terrains where their toughness is reduced, like crossbowmen in the desert, speeding things along. And as for countering, while it reduces the effectiveness of troops, since it only impacts damage, it also means countering enemies slows the pace of battle, buying time for you to bring reinforcements in. Finally, one little thing I wanted to include, there are often times where you want to split your troops, whether you be with an army, with siege and levies battering down a castle while your crack troops chase the enemy, or ensuring that your men stay below the supply limit and don't give the enemy a massive plus 20% or worse plus 50% advantage. Especially hanging around the desert, or the mountains, or the taiga, it can be useful to know what your men-at-arms are capable of taking on, as they may be leading a vanguard before the rest of your army can arrive. So, for this example, let's say you need to squeeze your army in a region of just 1,000 supply, which we don't want to breach. So capture just 1,000 troops, who can take on the most levies and for how much a month? Well, looking at this graph and bearing in mind both axes are in logs, we see the heavy cav can easily squeeze in the most damage, taking on over 6,000 levies, though for a prohibitive cost of 40 to 60 gold a month. You can see units of the same cost all aligned vertically, so Shoma, King of Troops at 0.45 gold a month, and Pakes, the King of Troops at 0.66 gold a month. Of all the longbows, the late one is obviously King, Bacheri is the best pike, Mabarism and Drazini are good heavies, and Varangian vets and Palatini do a bit better for excessively more coin. So, if marching across deserts with no supply is your thing, heavy cav will give you the damage for little space, despite somehow a man and a horse consisting of one supply. So far, when I included buffs, I have applied them evenly across all the troops. But the truth depends on your territory, financial situation and how you play, and it will be all over the place. And with the asymmetry in your territory, some troops will have better boosts than others, and some nothing if you have more regiments than territory. This can create a unique situation. Say we have this territory here. I have 5 counties with barony in each. 4 I've decided to build economic buildings so these light footmen get nothing, while on this mountain territory I decided to boost my troops with some magical hypothetical building that boosts my troops' damage and toughness by 100%. If we swap these light footmen with heavy infantry, we now have an army that performs better for every gold spent. It is more cost effective while being more expensive overall. Essentially, you're getting more bang for buck. If you swap the remaining light footmen with heavy infantry, while the army would perform better and obviously cost a lot more, it would now be less cost effective than the 2 prior compositions, which I think is really cool in a boring sort of way. So in summary, how asymmetrical the build of your lands are means using a combination of higher quality expensive troops where there are buffs and poorer quality troops where there are not can further increase the potency per upkeep overall. Just to add, I am aware there are points where it will be in the player's interest to not be cost effective, say when you run out of regiment slots and you need a big increase in quality to be able to win wars, or you are minted and have nothing else to invest in, or you may be concerned about supply and don't want to suffer attrition, or that horrid minus 25% advantage when starving. If so, picking up quality over numbers may be safer, or just suit your playstyle more. Not everybody enjoys micromanaging armies and checking how much food you've got in each barony has all the time. The main reason I'm doing cost effectiveness and not showing how a stack of say light footmen compares against heavy infantry of the same stack size is because it's obvious who is better. You just multiply the damage and the toughness, the bigger number wins. And now we come to the end game. It's no longer about winning, it's about wiping them out. About sending a message. Your enemy cannot reinforce what is no longer there. That's why the dream for so many players is stack wiping, or at least having enough troops to clean up. Can't have any of them getting home now, can we? To stack wipe, the requirements are simple. Defeat the enemy within 12 days. So, for this last test, we are simply seeing how much money does one need to wipe out 1,000 levies. And if we look at the top 20 to see the cheapest, we have bowmen at the top, so another strong performance for the bows. Then followed by a mixture of pikes, heavy infantry, horse archers, but crucially no heavy cav. What is consistent between these top 20 is they are all high damage units. The Bacheri is a high damage pike and the Chasseur a high damage and pursuit horseman, which makes sense because we need this battle over quickly. Another thing we could consider looking at is including pursuit in our calculations, as many of these troops have some, but without a bit of help from levies, the top 20 barely changes. So let's consider the pursuit phase as well. if reinforced with 500 levies, and if we do that the top 20 changes completely, longbowmen dropping to 4th below the other bows with pursuit. We have light footmen in 6th and a heavy infantry in 7th. That said, if they're bringing their screen, the pursuit you've invested in could mean nothing. Like in Iberia, if they're bringing their caballeros, it's almost impossible to be rid of your enemies in the pursuit phase. The tests are done, you've seen the results, and now I'm going to give my final thoughts. I'll tell you what I think is best, the good, and the surprisingly good, as well as a summary. But first, let's dive into the disappointing and the bad. The game does a pretty good job of making them all viable, and the cultural ones of having great synergy with their culture. However, some do stand out. The standard armoured footman is unfortunate. It does poorly in the surviving test, it does poorly in preserving, it does poorly in stack wiping, and it does okay in speeding up battles. It has no terrain weaknesses, so it is flexible, but it also lacks any terrain bonuses. Making things worse, bespoke heavy infantry men-at-arms are very common, and pretty much all of them are better, and have terrain and weather bonuses, and some counter 2 types, not just pikemen, leaving it being overlooked by many cultures, serving a small niche and tribal where you need a big damage output before armoured horsemen come along, and you don't have a cultural one available. Also, with the way stationing works, as discussed earlier, if a barony doesn't have much money making potential, it may be cost effective to buff them to their full potential. Mountain baronies are very good for this, but as for these tests, generally, they just don't stand out. But this is crucial. The still serves a niche bit, as there's still plenty of situations where they are the best choice, which I cannot say for the worst men-at-arms. Sarawit are truly awful, which is a shame because they come from a very cool tradition unique to the Ethiopians. They're meant to specialise in hilly and mountainous terrain, but they perform worse than the readily available pikemen. They have a bonus in mountains, but so do pikemen. They lose their pike counter to gain the light horseman counter, which is a worse counter, and light horsemen don't perform well in the hills anyway. But pikemen can at least counter camels and heavy cav as well, so why wouldn't you just use pikemen? To make it even worse, they're countered by horn warriors, which all of your cultural neighbours bar one have access to, and will use against you. They're the only armoured footman that has a terrain weakness, in this case, desert and drylands, and guess what there's plenty of to the north and east of you. Finally, to top it all off, they don't even stand out compared to their similar. So that's it. The Sarawit, outclassed by pikemen in every way, serving no niche and no purpose, truly abysmal. I hope a patch or DLC comes along and fixes it in the future. Now, the verdict you've all been waiting for, but let's be honest, you already know what it is if you've been watching. The Longbowmen, S tier. At the start of the game, this was one of the worst. In Tribal era, they're worse than bowmen. They do have an extra counter, but for a unit that doesn't exist in Western Europe till early medieval. But having the unique ability of increasing their damage and toughness each age means they go good in early medieval to fantastic in high and unstoppable in late. By this point, they are brilliant at surviving, brilliant at winning repeated battles, brilliant at obliterating your enemies. Just brilliant. Similar to crossbowmen, but omitting that weakness in common plains and drylands, making them much more flexible. If you can get them, they are likely to be the only troop you'll ever need, and to think that the Welsh are the only culture to start with the most powerful unit in the game. It's truly wonderful. Dayan. Following on from the Sublime and what I have frequently compared them to, we have the Crossbowmen. I have little to add on top of what has already been said for Longbowmen. They are cheap, powerful and consistently perform well. But most importantly are generic, meaning they're available to everybody. They also have the very rare Horse Archer counter, a must if you want to take on the steppe or anyone in it. The greatest limitation is their weakness in plains and drylands, and the fact they are only available in High Medieval. But when you can, incorporate them into your army as soon as possible. This may come across as an odd one, but gendarmes are fantastic. Looking at helping you survive, preserving your troops or crushing your enemies, they don't seem great. But without the war as a whole in view, we're in danger of overlooking them. Considering a few things, these combined with their performance makes them great. They can defeat enemies quickly. What they make up for in getting killed is bringing the battle to a close faster. And we've all seen it when the enemy is numerous and besieging. They spread themselves across territories, maximising sieges and minimising attrition. You can take advantage of this by attacking the army on the end, and they will start moving all their troops to reinforce. But it's too late. You have reached the grind zone, a point where you can defeat their troops faster than they can reinforce, but not too fast so the reinforcements aren't locked in. And then, as a result, they die as well, and the chain continues. Their stack size is smaller, meaning you can squeeze more power per troop. As a manless horse only consumes as much as a man, historically inaccurate yes, but very useful, helping you avoid attrition and the penalties that come with starving or low on supplies in battle. They have an advantage in the better terrains, and if you're in the game of making money, you typically want farmlands, and if you can't have them, plains. What is typically near farmlands? Plains. And where do armoured horsemen perform well? You're right, plains. Also, plains and drylands are the fastest terrain to travel through. So if you pick a point from A to B, your army will go through the path of least resistance, and often this means taking the lowlands, which your enemy will also do, and where your cavalry can do its work. Just avoid the mountain choke points. Finally, and this is key, the new stable buildings for each stage improves your army's speed. I cannot overstate how important this is. Late game, with 5 max stables, you get a 40% boost to your army speed, meaning you can dictate where battles are fought and have the means to chase down enemies before they can bunch together. All of these 5 things make them so valuable, along with their high damage. But why gendarme? Well, unlike heavy cav, they have a smaller nerf to their performance in hills, half the nerf, and that isn't really much of an issue. So while heavy cav are great, the gendarme is far more flexible. They're unlocked by the French, which has terrain where they are suited, unlike the cataphracts in the Byzantine Empire, which is all mountains and hills, and they may not be unlocked till the late medieval, but heavy cav don't truly come online until the late game anyway. Give them a go, just watch out for crossbows. Now, you may be reeling from my thoughts on heavy infantry, but now I'm here to shower some praise. The Varangian veterans are good. Very good. The only real drawback is they are slightly expensive, but what makes them stand out is their counter of heavy cav, which is nice, but more importantly their bonus in farmlands. Modest, but both to damage and toughness, and this synergizes well with the Vikings, as you can Varangian adventure to the best places. Cordoba, yours. Rome, why not? Micklegard, sure. Punjab, go nuts. Take the wealthiest territories with farmlands and plains and defend it with your veterans. Otherwise, other good heavy infantry are the Mabarism because of that power and being the only unit that counters itself, so you have to use it in the Middle East because your neighbours will, and the ARs because it is a cheaper, more powerful, has more counters and more pursuit compared to the generic one, frankly better in every way. And the Palatini, well, they are fine. Now we come to the men-at-arms that surprised me, and if you've been following this video, the one that stands out is the Shoma. A tribal-like footman is one of the best performing men-at-arms in the game, particularly at survival, which seems a little silly. But as we have shown, numbers count for a lot, even with combat width. But its USP is that toughness, that 24 toughness, a whopping 50% higher than your standard toughness for the same price. Nothing else is that good for that cheap. So what are the drawbacks? Though toughness is good, it doesn't help draw battles to a close much quicker, so if your enemy has reinforcements, they are going to get there. It loses the light infantry pursuit, which makes it strategically much worse, and now some of your buffs from your buildings are pointless. The biggest is that it needs a cultural perk available only to Israeli cultures, which are rare, so unless you start as a custom character or one of the few Israeli characters around, you will struggle to get this men-at-arms, and early. The perk that gives it to you, Defensive Tactics, is strange. To get this unit, you need to be happy with losing more troops in battle and paying for more for your heavies, which is something you might not be able to stomach. Otherwise, the Shoma is great and totally underrated, but as with light footmen on the whole, they become less effective as the game progresses. For example, let's look at the Netherlands. They get access to the Geodadag, another strong performer, and defensively they are suited very well for light footmen. You need a lot of supply to support the sheer number you could have. Farmlands, plains and coast do that very well. Be aggressive and go abroad and your big numbers are liable to starve. Split them up and they become weak. One other light footman to consider is the Gorge Volta. It performs terribly, so why consider it? Well, it has some strong terrain bonuses, the only men at arms to actually have a bonus in wetlands. But best of all, similar to elephants, it has a siege bonus. So having a stack of 2 is like also including a mangonel in your army without wasting a regiment slot, making it one of the most flexible and cost-effective men-at-arms early game. I stress early game because out of all the units to trail off, this one suffers the worst, but might be one to try out. And now for the star of the whole show, Bowmen. I knew crossbowmen would do well, but I did not expect bowmen to be such a success overall. But being cheap, being numerous, and high damage output allows them to perform very well at every stage of the game, and most importantly, dealing with enemies quickly. But just the culture specific ones are incredible. Just look at the top performers for stack wiping. Archers, stack wiping and pursuit, also archers, and in their own realm. Stick the Pakes in the jungle, it dominates. Stick the Matsenvatija in the woods, it dominates. Stick the Chukunu in the hills, mountains or desert, or classic, it dominates. But the Nile archers top it off, being better than late longbowmen in floodplains and drylands, but available at the start of the game. The fact they are bowmen with insane terrain bonuses and having access to pursuit means nobody should ever be able to invade you successfully. With Nile archers, you should easily be able to carve out a kingdom in the Fertile Crescent and hold off an entire holy war to take it back. They are that good. Probably my favourite discovery in this video. If you have a culture that has a unique bowman, then it is likely to be the best men-at-arms you have access to. And if you don't have any, then you always have crossbowmen. So pikemen didn't make much of an appearance in this video. Not that they're bad, but they just sit within the extremes. A very good all-rounder by having damage and toughness almost equal. They have utility, being the only generic men-at-arms with not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 counters. Admittedly, elephants are hard to come by in Europe, but if you head to the Holy Land, they're very good at camels. They're great in choke points, notably a lot of choke points in mountains where they get an incredible plus 12 bonus, making them one of the best pain sponges in the game. And a pain sponge is great when you have high prowess knights, as they can soak damage while your knights wail away unhindered. As for light horsemen, their main USP is outside of battles. Their main purpose is cleaning up survivors, useful in a war, but not in battle. They do contribute damage and counter, but they are quite expensive for that. And if you're of a strategic mind, they can be very valuable, but high risk. Once your enemies have blobbed their troops together successfully, you could be in a lot of danger. That said, there are many bespoke variants, some with mad good terrain bonuses making them much more viable in battle, notably the camels and the chasseurs. Overall, the men-at-arms in this DLC are pretty good. Bear in mind all these tests were done with money, and all these stats are in tribal, so most of what we've discussed isn't applicable in the early game. And if you are a violent type, prestige shouldn't be hard to come by. Oddly, I think most starting positions for the Vikings favours the Huskal over the Varangian veteran, crucially suited to the woods and the tiger of the north, and countering bowmen instead of armoured horsemen. That said, Vikings are flexible, able to Varangian veteran anywhere and able to pick the best spots. And you do want the best spots like Cordoba or Sicily, because all of your special men-at-arms have bonuses in farmlands and plains as mentioned earlier. No other men-at-arms has that bonus. And in the terrain, they do well against their generic counterparts, so it will make defending your newly claimed territory easy. I was disappointed with this DLC as we got no new men-at-arms, but what we do have is the local pre-DLC unit, the Caballero. Combines very well with state ransoming tradition as I have shown in this video, It is an incredibly popular unit, making pursuit almost pointless on the peninsula as their screen is mad. So something to watch out for. Thankfully, the Legacy of Persia DLC has given us 4 new ones. Most of them performed poorly in the test, the Asawira doing very badly, but that is because they are all very heavily focused on their preferred terrain. And I must say, in their terrain they are great, making them all very strong defensive men-at-arms. Except the Asawira, as they have a plains bonus, so good for taking on Anatolia and further beyond. And interestingly, the Asawira being a horse archer means it has no real counters till crossbowmen are online. For some reason, the Tarkan's best terrain is Oasis. Why? No idea. Are there any oases in the region? No. So with notable men-at-arms covered, I'd thought I'd give a more general summary of what seems to be the key things you need to consider with men-at-arms. Again, this focuses mainly on cost effectiveness, but how you wish to play is truly up to you. Otherwise, here are my 10 rules for rulers. 1. Prepare for the terrain you are likely to be fighting in. 2. Counter who you are most likely to be fighting. 3. The cheaper the counter the better, the more counters the better. 4. Focus on countering high damage men-at-arms as a priority. Heavy cav, heavy infantry and bowmen. 5. Fill your regiments as quickly as possible. Numbers matter most at the start. Once full, then focus on quality. 6. Make the most out of your economically poor land to boost high quality men-at-arms, like heavy infantry in the mountains. 7. Have a source of pursuit in the army for big wars or revolts. 8. Bowmen and alternatives perform well in early, mid and late game. Their high damage for how cheap they are allows for strategy, wiping out troops before reinforcements and potentially stack wiping. 9. Transition to crossbowmen when you can. 10. Transition to heavy cav if appropriate. This video focused heavily on cost effectiveness, and there will be many points in Crusader Kings where money isn't everything. There is no actual correct way to play. The joy of Crusader Kings is that it straddles being a grand strategy and a role-playing game. So if you want to hemorrhage money on men-at-arms, go for it. If you want to spend your time reducing the upkeep to peanuts, sure, why not? If you want to anachronistically rebuild the Roman legions to live some weird power fantasy, go nuts. I just wanted to know, if you took penny pinch to the extreme, who would come out on top, but in reality the influence of strategy, context, playstyle and a lack of competitive multiplayer means there will never be a true meta. Now, there are many things I didn't cover, a good example being mixed compositions, but with how long it has taken me since the last video, perhaps a good idea to avoid, but leaving me with much to cover in the future if you like this video. And on that note, if you think I'm wrong or made a mistake or missed something out, or that your favourite men-at-arms is such and such and this is why, please fill me in. If there is a scenario that you want me to run in the scripts, tell me, I might even make a video trying them out. Otherwise, at the very least, I hope you have found this video insightful. I'm Kiosk Thanks for watching.